Sup dudes, it's me, Josh. Now before we get into today's video, I have a pretty major announcement, being that I am now helping to make and produce videos for the American Populist Union. Partially because of this, the fabled political video has been cancelled, but instead, I'll be making political content over there that y'all can watch. Now, let's get into today's topic. So, after reading the title of this video, I'm sure that a good amount of you are wondering, well wait, the French monarchy was restored in 1815 after the fall of Napoleon, and you would be absolutely correct. However, that's not what we're talking about today. And before I'm able to get into that, there's gonna be quite a bit of background that I'm gonna need to explain. So, the year is 1789, and due to economic hardship, poor leadership, famine, and several other issues, the French Revolution broke out, seeking to destroy the Christian, hierarchical, and traditional system that had provided stability to France for centuries, replacing it with an atheist, egalitarian, and unstable regime, which caused the deaths of many. The revolutionaries would remove their king, Louis XVI, in more ways than one, and France would then establish its first republic. Power changed hands a couple times, before eventually Napoleon rose to power and declared himself Emperor of the French in 1804. Napoleon waged war across the entire European continent until eventually, in 1815, he fell from power and the original monarchy was restored with Louis XVIII, brother of Louis XVI, as king. However, the restoration of the monarchy would end up sparking the core conflict between French monarchists, being that between the Legitimists and the Orleanists. For context, the French royal family was divided into two major branches. The more conservative, senior, and thus more legitimate branch would be known as the Legitimist branch, and the more liberal, junior House of Orleans would be known as the Orleanist branch. As you could probably guess, the two sides were in pretty much constant conflict during the mid-19th century over the succession to the French crown, and our pal Louis XVIII was part of the Legitimist branch. Louis's reign would last until his death in 1824, at which point he was succeeded by his brother, Charles X. And although Charles was rather popular at first, he would end up trying to dismantle the destructive principles of the French Revolution and censor highly manipulative media, which led to him losing support from the masses. In 1830, Charles would become the victim of yet another French Revolution, which would come to be known as the July Revolution. Seeing that his days as king were numbered, Charles decided to abdicate the throne in favor of his grandson, a 10-year-old boy who would have been known as Henry V. However, this would never come to fruition, as an Orleanist candidate, Louis Philippe, would end up being put into power instead. Fast forward another 18 years to the year 1848, and because there is literally no appeasing the mob, yet another French Revolution happened, which saw Louis Philippe, the same guy that revolutionaries put into power just 18 years earlier, would end up being removed from power by same said revolutionaries. Anyways, the revolution would result in a second French Republic, but it would only last a couple years before some funky looking fellow decided he wanted to proclaim himself emperor, almost like Napoleon. Wait, it was Napoleon III, that is. Napoleon III's reign would last until 1870, in which France's defeat against Prussia during the Franco-Prussian War would lead to his capture and removal from power. The provisional government that was subsequently created would hold an election which saw the monarchists gain a sizable majority and thus make a push to try to restore the monarchy. And although there was some initial squabbling between the Legitimists and Orleanists over who should become king, they eventually settled on a compromise in which a Legitimist would become king and an Orleanist would be his heir. And so, an offer was sent to the Legitimist candidate, and who better than our old friend, Henry V. However, despite the throne of France being handed to him on a silver platter, he refused for several reasons, mostly due to him wanting to remove any traces of the French Revolution. But even after further negotiation and compromise, he still refused, and on the topic of all things, the flag. For some reason, Henry would only agree to become king if the tricolor flag was removed. However, the French flag was extremely popular in France, so the people would never let the tricolor flag go. This whole debacle got so stupid that Pope Pius IX would even remark, "And all that for a napkin." And so, Henry, quite obviously, never accepted the offer to become king, and the French monarchy was never restored. But what if Henry decided to just stop being stupid about the flag, took the offer, and became King of France? Well, shortly after the offer would be accepted, Henry would be crowned as King Henry V of France, with an Orleanist named Louis Philippe II as his heir. Though, despite the monarchists having had a large majority in the French legislature at that point, it is still important to note that there was still a rather strong Republican opposition, and with the monarchy being restored, this opposition would grow even more. However, since Louis Philippe II was much more liberal than Henry, this would provide a light at the end of the tunnel for the Republicans who didn't want to live under Henry's much more conservative and anti-revolutionary reign. This may also lead to a number of assassination attempts against Henry V, but although anything could happen, I don't really see any of these succeeding. So how exactly would Henry V reign? Well, as I said earlier, Henry was rather conservative and wanted to dismantle any traces of the revolution. If the monarchists in the legislature managed to pass a good amount of Henry's agenda, this could lead to a pretty good amount of change in France and help to remove a decent amount of the terrible and destabilizing principles of the French Revolution. However, as previously stated, this would lead to a much greater amount of political opposition and unrest, which would probably lead to some terrible consequences later down the line. As for foreign policy, not much would really change, as France's foreign policy would remain centered around gaining colonies overseas and being pissed at Germany. After Henry would eventually die, probably sometime in the 1880s or 1890s, he would be succeeded by Louis Philippe II. And now, with the French crown being passed from the Legitimist branch to the Orleanist branch, this could lead to a decent amount of conflict between them. All of this political unrest and tension, coming from both Republicans and internal conflict between monarchists, would eventually come to a boiling point, causing yet another French Revolution, or even a full-blown civil war. Such a revolt would likely lead to the creation of another republic, but France's sheer instability at this point would have caused their economy to collapse, as well as damage their ability to fight in any potential wars. This would shortly become very important, as right around the corner was the First World War. Since France would be so engulfed in its own internal turmoil, once the conflict that would eventually grow into World War I rolled around, they would probably just stay out of it, because if they tried to fight against the much stronger German Empire, they would know that France wouldn't even stand a chance. Hey, cool, that rhymed. This would mean that the First World War would never have escalated to the point that it did, and would have instead remained concentrated in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. In this alternate version of World War I, the Central Powers would have easily been able to overpower Russia and Serbia. Since Russia was already well down the path towards revolution, the Russian Revolution would still happen, but German influence would have been able to extend a good way into Eastern Europe. In the Balkans, Austria would have become a much more dominant power, and although they wouldn't have directly annexed any land, they would have held much more influence over what goes on around there. As for the rest of Europe, and the rest of the world, the lack of an escalated World War I would have led to some pretty major changes. The monarchies of Germany and Austria would have remained in power, as they wouldn't have faced a defeat in a war as terrible as World War I in our timeline. In Italy, since they wouldn't have gotten screwed over in the subsequent peace conference, fascism wouldn't have risen there, nor anywhere else. In America, Because we wouldn't have been able to profit so much off of the war, the economic boom of the 1920s would never have happened, and thus the Great Depression never happens either, meaning American society wouldn't have gone under the rapid changes that it had in our timeline. So, overall, if Henry had decided to take the throne in 1870, this would have led to a great amount of instability in France, leading to an eventual revolution, which would keep them from being able to engage in a conflict such as World War I. Without them engaging in this war, this would mean that Europe would stay much more stable, and traditional Western society would have been able to be maintained for quite a bit longer. So, in essence, this one doofus getting mad about a napkin led to the downfall of Western civilization. Thanks, Henry. Thanks. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you want to see more content like this, please make sure to stick around and maybe subscribe or something. If you want regular updates and such, make sure to join our very epic Discord server. And if you want to see some more political content from me, please make sure to look for me whenever I make content for the APU. Well, till next time, see ya.